This is a true horror story, shared directly by the person who experienced it. A chilling encounter in an old, colonial-era hospital that remains burned into my memory to this day. Tonight, I will recount the terrifying night I spent at Simpang Lima Regional Hospital. What is it like to sit and have a silent encounter with someone who passed away hours prior? Watch until the very end to find out. My father's words are still deeply carved into my memory. He used to tell me that hospitals are, in their own way, sacred places. He believed that behind those sterile white walls, millions of the most genuine prayers are uttered every single second, both by those fighting for their last breath and the families keeping vigil by their side. Yet, no matter how comforting those words were meant to be, they never managed to lift the heavy, suffocating dread that settled in my chest every time I stepped inside one. I have witnessed the sorrow of goodbyes far too many times, not from the perspective of those left behind, but from the hollow, distant gaze of those preparing to depart this world. My name is Bagas. This story took place back when I was a freshman at a university in Semarang, renting a small room in the Pleberon area. One evening, I received a text message from Rian, my closest friend since high school. He told me that his father, Mr. Rahman, had just been rushed to the Simpang Lima Regional Hospital. His condition had taken a sudden, severe turn for the worse due to a chronic lung infection he had been battling for years. Since my place was quite close to the hospital, I decided to head over immediately to offer my support. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening when I arrived at Simpang Lima Hospital. It was a massive complex, and back then, it hadn't undergone any modern renovations. The architecture still heavily retained its old Dutch colonial roots, boasting towering ceilings, massive concrete pillars, and sprawling open-air corridors. Mr. Rahman's ward was located at the very back of the complex, in a building that bordered the one place everyone avoided at night, the morgue. However, that first night felt relatively normal. The atmosphere wasn't completely dead yet, as a few relatives of other patients could still be seen walking around the ward. Inside the room, I watched Rian tenderly rub warming oil onto his father's frail body. After spending some time with them, Rian signaled for us to step outside to the front veranda so his father could rest. We sat on a long wooden bench where Rian poured his heart out, admitting that if there was no medical improvement by the end of the week, the family planned to take his father home for hospice care. Our conversation stretched until midnight, before I finally said my goodbyes, promising Rian I would return the following evening to help him watch over his father. The next day, a small twist of fate set the nightmare in motion. After my afternoon classes, I went back to my room, intending to rest for just an hour before heading back out. Unfortunately, sheer exhaustion took over, and I fell into a deep sleep, only waking up when the clock on my wall read 11 p.m. Panicking because I had broken my promise, I threw on the nearest clothes and rushed out. I tried calling Rian, but his phone was completely unreachable. Assuming he had turned it off to let it charge, I hopped on my motorbike and sped toward the hospital. By the time I arrived, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Visiting hours had long since passed, and the main entrance was deserted. Refusing to turn back, I waited for a moment of distraction and managed to slip past the security guard through a side corridor. But the air tonight felt entirely different. It was deafeningly silent. Not a single soul was in sight along the open walkway, which was supported only by massive, weathered wooden pillars. The biting Semarang night air pierced right through my thin t-shirt and shorts. The 300-meter corridor suddenly felt miles long, the only sound being the hollow echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the ancient ceiling. It felt like walking through a dead, abandoned monument. My pace slowed as my eyes caught a silhouette at the far end of the hallway, right outside the ward entrance. Someone was sitting quietly on the exact same long wooden bench Rian and I had occupied the night before. Under the dim, flickering hallway light from about 20 meters away, the build of the person felt instantly familiar. As I drew closer, my anxiety dissolved into a wave of relief. It was Mr. Rahman, the man who just the night before could barely shift his waiting bed, was now sitting upright in the cool night air. I immediately greeted him, expressing my joy and relief at seeing him looking so well. Mr. Rahman turned his head and acknowledged my greeting with a slight, faint smile, softly reassuring me that he was indeed feeling much better. When I inquired about Rian's whereabouts, he explained in a quiet, flat voice that his son had to leave abruptly for their hometown in Serang due to an urgent family matter. In my mind, I felt a flash of annoyance toward Rian for leaving without a word. When I asked his father who was staying to look after him, Mr. Rahman smiled again, gently assuring me that he didn't need anyone and that he was perfectly fine on his own. We ended up sitting side by side on that wooden bench, engulfed by a creeping silence, until Mr. Rahman eventually excused himself to use the restroom inside the building, his smile completely vanishing as he stood up. Just a few minutes after Mr. Rahman disappeared into the darkness of the building, the phone in my pocket vibrated. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from Rian. I answered it immediately with a frustrated tone, demanding to know why he had gone to Serang without telling me. On the other end of the line, Rian's voice sounded incredibly strange, heavy, trembling, and choked with suppressed tears. He whispered an apology, explaining that his phone had died and he hadn't found a place to charge it. A second later, my entire world shattered. Rian choked out the words, explaining that his father had passed away suddenly at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and the family had already transported his body back to Serang by ambulance hours ago. He then asked, with palpable confusion, if I had avoided going to the hospital tonight. My heart stopped beating. The blood drained entirely from my face. My tongue turned to stone as I looked toward the dark restroom doorway. Emerging from the shadows, the figure of Mr. Rahman walked back out. He glided straight toward me and sat right back down in his original spot, directly to my left. That was the moment my eyes truly adjusted. Under the dim, amber light, the face right next to me was completely bloodless. It was cold, stark, and utterly devoid of life. Without a word, I slowly lowered my phone and cut the line. My body froze completely. A paralyzing terror locked every single joint in my frame. We sat there in absolute silence during what became the longest, most agonizing 5 minutes of my existence. For an eternity, the entity next to me stared blankly straight ahead. While I didn't dare to look at him even for a fraction of a second, cold sweat drenching my clothes. In my mind, I desperately repeated every prayer for protection I could remember. Then, the oppressive silence broke. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Mr. Raymond's head begin to move. He was slowly, deliberately twisting his neck to the left, turning his face directly toward where I sat. Before that pale face could fully turn to meet my gaze, pure survival instinct took over. I abruptly bolted to my feet, muttering a hurried, trembling farewell just to break the tension. I was answered by a chillingly cold response that echoed in the empty air. As I caught a final glimpse of the face, the skin had turned a harsh, powdery white, resembling a horrific, unnatural mask worlds away from the man I had spoken to earlier. On the verge of fainting, I watched as the figure suddenly stood up and glided right past me. He moved down the hallway, and to my absolute horror, his feet were not touching the ground. His body simply floated into the darkness of the corridor until he vanished completely. I stood rooted to the spot, gasping for air, until a sudden hand clapped down on my shoulder from behind. It was a security guard on his nightly rounds. Unable to explain, I merely stammered that I was a patient's relative getting some fresh air. The moment the guard walked away, I forced my weak, trembling legs to move as fast as possible toward the front lobby, started my bike, and tore away from that cursed place without ever looking back. The next morning, I traveled straight to Serong to attend the funeral. To this day, Rian has no idea what happened that night. I chose to keep that terrifying memory locked away in silence until tonight.